Moses, a lover of women, lived in a small town. He was rich, very rich. His wealth was known far and wide, but more than his riches, what Moses loved the most were women. He had a soft spot for them, and every woman knew it. Whenever Moses saw a woman he desired, he showered her with money, gifts, anything she wanted. And because he was so wealthy, women came to him easily. They smiled, they followed, and Moses welcomed them all. Moses married a beautiful woman named Rose. Rose loved Moses, but she wasn't like the other women. Rose was strong, she was stubborn. In the whole village, no one dared to cross Rose. Her eyes blazed like fire when she was angry, and her words were as sharp as a blade. But Moses didn't care, he loved his beautiful wife. They had children together, and Rose took care of the home. Even though Moses loved other women, Rose stood by him, always watching. Everyone in the village knew Rose was not a woman to be trifled with. Moses' life was full of riches and women, but little did he know, trouble was coming. Rose loved Moses deeply, but her love came with fire. She didn't like how Moses' eyes wandered to other women, it made her heart burn with anger. Whenever Rose saw Moses talking to another woman, her face twisted with rage. She didn't care who it was, she would fight them, scream at them, and send them running. Even though Rose had children with Moses, her heart remained restless. She loved him, but his wandering eyes made her feel like the ground was shaking beneath her feet. Moses was always looking for the next woman, and it made Rose furious. One day, Moses came home with news that turned Rose's world upside down. He had married another wife. Her name was Mary, and she was beautiful, so beautiful that Moses couldn't resist her. Mary had smooth skin, a quiet smile, and eyes that shone like the moon. But to Rose, Mary was like a thorn. From that moment, trouble started in Moses' home. Rose's heart was full of jealousy, and Mary became her target. The house that was once full of peace began to tremble with fights and anger. And the storm that would lead to Moses losing his manhood was just beginning. Mary was gentle, with a soft voice and a quiet way of moving. She never wanted trouble, but Rose didn't care. From the day Mary entered their home, Rose's anger grew like wildfire. She couldn't stand the sight of Mary and made sure Mary felt her wrath every day. "Go and sweep the house," Rose would command, her sharp eyes pointing. Mary would quietly obey, sweeping every corner while Rose's children sat and laughed at her. "Go and fetch water," Rose's voice would ring out again and again. And Mary, with no other choice, would pick up the water pot and walk to the stream, her feet dragging with exhaustion. While she worked, Rose's children played, laughing at how much their stepmother had to do. Mary couldn't take it anymore. She went to Moses, hoping he would help her, but Moses didn't care. His mind was always on the next woman he could marry. He barely listened to Mary's complaints. "I'll talk to her," Moses would say, but his words were empty, he never did anything. And so Mary had to endure. Every day, Rose made her life harder and harder, and there was no escape. Mary worked and suffered, and there was no one to save her. Moses' eyes never rested. Even with Rose and Mary in his home, his love for women only grew stronger. One day, while visiting the town, Moses met another woman. Her name was Angela, and she was different from the village women. She was young, with smooth skin, bright eyes, and a smile that could stop anyone in their tracks. Moses couldn't resist, he married her without thinking twice. But Angela wasn't like the other wives. She didn't marry Moses out of love. She only saw his riches, and in her heart, she thought, "This old man won't last long. When he dies, I'll take everything and leave this village forever." When Angela moved into the house, the fragile piece that was already broken shattered into pieces. Rose, who once ruled the house with her stubbornness, felt threatened. Mary, who had already suffered in silence, now had to deal with Angela's boldness. Angela was not like Mary, who quietly did as Rose commanded. No, Angela was bold, and she refused to be pushed around. She didn't care about Rose or Mary, nor was she afraid of Rose's fiery temper or her bullying. Angela refused to do any chores, and she made sure everyone knew she was in charge. Even Rose's children had to listen to her. "Go and fetch water for me," Angela would say, and the children had no choice but to obey. Not even Rose's sharp words could stop Angela from doing as she pleased. As usual, Moses didn't care. He was blinded by Angela's beauty, giving her whatever she wanted. Rose and Mary's complaints fell on deaf ears, and with Angela's arrival, the house became a boiling pot of anger, jealousy, and trouble. The storm that had begun with Mary was now a raging fire, and there was no one to stop it. When Rose or Mary tried to complain, Moses would wave them off. He didn't want to hear it, he was too busy enjoying Angela's company to care about what the others had to say. "Moses, can't you see how she treats us?" Rose would shout, but Moses wouldn't even look up. Mary, who had long endured Rose's cruelty, realized something important. The only way to handle Angela was to team up with Rose. Though Rose had always been her tormentor, they both now shared the same goal: they needed to get rid of Angela. And so, Rose and Mary, once enemies, came together. They whispered and planned, knowing that if they didn't act soon, Angela would continue to control the household. Their plan was simple: if they couldn't defeat Angela alone, they would do it together. The two women became allies in their fight against the one woman who had disrupted their world. Rose knew Moses all too well, his eyes always wandered toward the young and beautiful. That gave them an idea. If they could find a woman more beautiful than Angela, Moses' attention would shift. He would forget about Angela, and she would lose her place as the favorite wife. "We need someone he can't resist," Rose whispered to Mary. Mary nodded, agreeing that this was their only way. After days of thinking, Mary remembered a woman she had seen in the village. Her name was Ruth, and she was just the type Moses liked: tall, with skin as smooth and shiny as polished clay, and legs that seemed to go on forever. Her sweet smile and gentle eyes turned heads wherever she went. "She's perfect," Mary said with a sly grin. Rose's eyes lit up. They knew that if Moses saw Ruth, his heart would leap, and he would quickly make her his wife. Their plan was set. They would introduce Ruth to Moses, and just like that, Angela would be pushed aside. The power would shift once again. Together, they approached Ruth with their plan. They offered her gifts and promises, telling her that Moses would spoil her with riches if she became his wife. Ruth, eager for wealth, agreed without hesitation. And so, the trap was laid. Ruth began spending time near the popular fruit seller, knowing Moses would soon notice her. Rose and Mary waited, watching closely, certain that their plan would work and that Angela's reign in the household would soon come to an end. Just as Rose and Mary had planned, Moses' eyes fell on Ruth one evening as she sat by the fruit cellar. Her tall figure, glowing skin, and sweet smile caught his attention immediately. Moses' heart skipped a beat. Without wasting time, he approached her, and within days, he made up his mind: Ruth would be his next wife. Moses married Ruth, and soon she was brought into the house as the fourth wife. Rose and Mary watched with satisfaction, their plan unfolding just as they had hoped. They knew Moses' heart would now be distracted from Angela, and the power she once had would slip away. But when Angela heard the news, she was furious. Her face burned with anger, and she couldn't believe that Moses had married another woman. She rushed to him, her voice trembling as she begged, "Moses, please, you don't need another wife. I am enough for you." Moses looked at her calmly and said, "Angela, that's how I married you too. Rose and Mary were here before you came. You'll get used to it, just like they did." Angela felt as if a stone had been dropped into her chest. She couldn't believe how easily Moses dismissed her feelings. He didn't care, just as he had married her while Rose and Mary were already in the house, now Ruth had joined them too. Angela had no choice but to accept it, but her anger boiled inside her. Meanwhile, Rose and Mary were silently celebrating, knowing that the balance of power had shifted once again. Ruth was now in the house, and it was Angela's turn to feel the sting of being pushed aside. Angela's heart filled with frustration as each day passed. She watched as Rose and Ruth grew closer, whispering and laughing together, leaving her out. She felt like an outsider in her own home. Whenever they sat together in the evenings, sharing stories and jokes, Angela would sit alone, anger swelling inside her. She couldn't take it anymore. Angela decided to visit her mother, hoping for some comfort or advice. Her mother listened quietly as Angela poured out her frustration, telling her how Moses was now showering all his attention and gifts on Ruth. "Mother, I can't stand it. He hardly looks at me anymore," Angela cried. But her mother was calm. She held Angela's hand and said, "Patience, my daughter. Remember why you married Moses in the first place. He's old. Soon enough, he'll be gone, and all his wealth will be yours." Angela nodded, trying to calm herself. Her mother's words made sense. She had married Moses for his riches, not for love. All she had to do was wait. But waiting wasn't easy. Every day, Moses gave more attention to Ruth, gifts of gold earrings, necklaces, new clothes, and Angela's frustration only grew deeper. The sight of Ruth glowing with Moses' love made Angela's blood boil. She had been patient for too long, but she knew, deep down, that her time would come. For now, she would wait, but her anger bubbled under the surface, ready to explode at any moment. One bright morning, it was Ruth's turn to cook for the entire household. The sun had barely risen when Ruth started preparing the meal. As the hours passed, the aroma of spices and herbs filled the air, wafting out of the compound and reaching the neighbors. People passing by sniffed the air, wondering if there was a celebration happening. The smell was so rich and delicious that even the birds seemed to stop and enjoy it. Ruth had outdone herself. She prepared a soup so flavorful that, by the time she finished, the whole house was buzzing with excitement. The wives, children, and even the servants sat eagerly waiting to taste the meal. When it was time to serve, Ruth brought out bowls of steaming hot soup with fresh, soft swallow, and everyone gathered around to eat. As they dug in, their praises filled the air. "Ruth, this is the best soup I've ever tasted," Rose exclaimed, licking her fingers. "Yes, what's your secret?" Mary added, her eyes wide with surprise. Even the children, who were usually picky eaters, ate until their bellies were full. Everyone was happy, chatting and laughing as they ate. The joy of the meal filled the compound like a festival. But as everyone enjoyed the food, Angela felt uneasy. She had noticed something odd. Moses, who was usually out chasing women or sitting around, hadn't been seen all morning. It was unlike him to be so quiet, especially on a day when the house was filled with such delicious food. While the others continued eating and praising Ruth's cooking, Angela's mind was racing. "Where is Moses?" she thought. Normally, Moses would have been the first to eat, but he hadn't touched the food, and no one seemed to notice. Her eyes scanned the room, and the uneasy feeling in her stomach grew stronger. Something wasn't right. Angela pushed her bowl aside and quietly stood up, her heart pounding with worry. She needed to find out where Moses was, but a strange fear slowed her steps. Why hadn't anyone else noticed? She wondered. And why did everyone seem so calm except for her? Angela decided it was time to investigate. Something about this feast felt very, very wrong. As the day wore on, Moses' friends arrived at the house, wondering where he was. They had planned to meet him for a big party, and Moses, who never missed a gathering, was unusually late. The friends called out from the gate, but there was no sign of him. "Where's Moses?" one of them asked, and the wives came out to greet them. Ruth, calm as ever, smiled and said, "He went out early this morning. He won't be back for a while." Moses' friends were puzzled. Moses would never leave without telling them, especially not on the day of a party. Still, They trusted Ruth's words and were about to leave when Angela, who had been quietly watching, stepped forward. "No, something isn't right," Angela said, her voice tense. "He hasn't been seen all morning. We need to check Ruth's room and the other wives' rooms." Moses' friends exchanged confused glances. Ruth looked unfazed, her face still as calm as ever. "What? Why would Moses be in my room?" she asked sweetly. But Angela didn't back down. Her heart was pounding, and the strange feeling she'd had all morning was now too strong to ignore. "I don't know," Angela replied, "but we need to look." Reluctantly, they all followed Angela to Ruth's room. The air felt thick with tension as they opened the door. Inside, the room was quiet, too quiet. Angela's stomach turned as her eyes swept across the space. Then suddenly, she gasped. There, lying on the floor, was Moses. His hands and legs were tightly bound with ropes, and his mouth was stuffed with cloth. Blood stained his clothes, and the sight made everyone freeze in horror. But the most shocking part was what was missing. Moses' manhood had been cut off. A scream tore through the room as Angela backed away, her hand covering her mouth. Rose and Mary stood in stone-cold silence, their faces pale. Moses' friends rushed forward, untying him quickly, but it was too late. Moses' body was limp, his eyes barely open. The once proud and powerful man was now broken and bleeding. Ruth stood in the doorway, her calm smile gone. She didn't say a word as the horror of the scene unfolded before her. The terrible discovery shook the house to its core. The man who had once ruled over his wives, chasing women and living in luxury, now lay powerless, his life hanging by a thread. The house, once full of laughter and joy from the feast, had turned into a place of fear and shock. And now, everyone's eyes turned toward Ruth, knowing she held the key to this nightmare. The news of what had happened spread quickly through the village. It wasn't long before a crowd gathered outside Moses' house. Ruth was held down, her arms tied, her face no longer calm. The air was thick with whispers, and everyone waited for her to speak. They wanted to know why she had done something so terrible. As the silence stretched, Ruth finally lifted her head, her voice cold but steady. "Yes, I did it. I cut off Moses' manhood," she began. The crowd gasped, but she continued without flinching. "I couldn't take it anymore," Ruth said, her eyes blazing with anger. "Moses couldn't stop, one woman after another. Even after marrying me, he couldn't rest. Just yesterday, I saw him with another woman, holding her close. She was beautiful, young, and I thought, here we go again, another one he's planning to bring into this house." The crowd listened in shock, hanging on to every word. "I followed them, watching," Ruth continued, her voice growing more intense. "He was laughing with her, touching her face, and I knew then that he would marry her. I wasn't going to let that happen, not again. I wanted it to end for good. If I cut off his manhood, he couldn't marry any more women, no more chasing after anyone." But then Ruth paused, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't know the woman he was with was his sister." A murmur spread through the crowd, Moses' sister, not another woman. Ruth's eyes darkened as she continued her confession. "I thought she was just another woman he wanted to marry," she explained, her regret slowly surfacing. "I didn't know. I thought I was saving myself from being pushed aside again, just like his other wives before me. So I planned to stop him once and for all." Then Ruth turned her cold gaze to Rose and Mary. "But I wasn't the only one. Rose and Mary, they were in this too. They had their own plan. They wanted to teach Angela a lesson, so they came up with the idea. They said we should cut off Moses' manhood. That will stop him, they said. That will make him stay at home. But they didn't have the courage to do it themselves. I did." The villagers turned their eyes toward Rose and Mary, who stood frozen. Rose, always proud and strong, now looked small and afraid. Mary's hands trembled as she tried to speak, but the guilt was written all over her face. Rose stammered, "It was just talk, we never thought she would actually do it." But the truth had been laid bare. Ruth's jealousy and misunderstanding had driven her to commit the terrible act, and Rose and Mary's schemes had only made the situation worse. The villagers could hardly believe what they were hearing. A mix of jealousy, misunderstanding, and betrayal had led to the destruction of Moses' household. As Ruth's confession hung in the air, the villagers stood frozen in disbelief. But the shock wasn't over yet. "And the soup you all ate this morning," Ruth added, her voice cold and chilling. "The meat in that soup, it was Moses' manhood." A wave of horror swept through the crowd. The women gasped, and the men stepped back in disgust, their stomachs turning as they realized what they had consumed. The once joyous feast had turned into a nightmare beyond imagination. Rose, who had been silent until now, saw her chance and tried to slip away quietly, hoping to escape the villagers' wrath. But before she could disappear, someone grabbed her arm. "Where do you think you're going, Rose?" a voice called out. The crowd quickly surrounded her, and she was forced to face their angry stares. Rose's face went pale as she realized there was no way out. Trembling, she stammered, "I didn't mean for it to happen this way. It was just a moment of anger. I was so frustrated with Moses' endless marriages. I only suggested cutting off his manhood out of desperation. I didn't think Ruth would actually do it." The crowd erupted in murmurs of disbelief. "So it was true," someone shouted. Rose's eyes reddened, her face desperate to find a way out. "It was just talk. We were all angry, but I never wanted it to go this far. I just wanted him to stop chasing women." But the villagers weren't convinced. The damage had been done, and Moses' life was lost because of Rose's careless words and Ruth's cold actions. Mary stood quietly to the side, her face filled with regret, but Rose was at the center of it all. The whole village was stunned by the evil that had taken place in Moses' house. What started as a plan to get rid of one wife had spiraled into something dark and twisted. The once proud and stubborn Rose was now caught in the very web she had helped spin, and the villagers could hardly believe what they had just witnessed. The tale of betrayal, jealousy, and anger had reached its darkest point, and the weight of their actions fell heavily on Rose, Ruth, and the entire village. Moses' fate was sealed. Despite the villagers' efforts to save him, his injuries were too severe, and he died not long after. His once powerful presence in the village was gone, leaving behind a household shattered by betrayal. The village elders gathered to decide what to do with the women involved. Ruth, who had committed the unthinkable, and Rose, whose jealous schemes had led to the tragedy, were at the center of the storm. Mary, though less involved, had still been part of the plan, and her role couldn't be ignored. After long discussions, the elders reached their decision: Ruth and Rose were to be banished from the village for their crimes. They could no longer stay among the people they had betrayed and deceived. Ruth's cold actions and Rose's poisonous jealousy had no place in the village anymore. Mary, though her involvement wasn't as deep, was also sent away. Her silence and participation had contributed to Moses' downfall. The villagers gathered at the edge of the village to watch as the women were forced to leave. Their heads hung low, and their once proud faces were now filled with shame and regret. Rose, once feared and respected, was now a shadow of her former self, and Ruth, who had entered Moses' house with dreams of wealth, left with nothing. The village, still shocked by the events, decided that Moses' children would inherit his property when they were older. They would be cared for by relatives until they were old enough to claim their rightful place. The house, once full of laughter, jealousy, and turmoil, now stood quiet, its story forever marked by tragedy. As the years passed, the tale of how Rose and Ruth betrayed Moses spread far beyond the village. People whispered about it around fires, and the story became a warning to others about the dangers of jealousy, greed, and revenge. Though time moved on, the memory of that fateful day lingered in the hearts of the villagers, reminding them of the darkness that could grow from within. The once great Moses, brought down by the very women he trusted, became a ghost in the village's history. And the story of Rose's betrayal would never be forgotten. I hope you enjoyed the story. If so, please like the video, comment on what you learned from the tale, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more enchanting stories just like this one. Thank you.